Good afternoon, fellow Americans. My name is Jesse Banal, and I am very proud to be here today as the lawyer for Ladar, Levison, and Lavabit Incorporated. Lavabit, which is founded by Ladar, is an email communication service that was set up in order to protect people's privacy and anonymity. And Ladar is going to talk to you today, and I'll take full credit for the fact that there's still a lot of things that he can't talk about, and that is very unfortunate. It's not his choice, but there are legal requirements out there that make it so there's still a lot of things that he can't say because he's afraid he might go to jail if he does. That is the stakes that he's living under every day right now in the fight that he is waging in order to allow us to be secure in our communications with each other on the internet. So I apologize in advance for being the lawyer that tells him that there's a lot he can't talk about. You can blame me rather than him. But I'm going to introduce you now to a man that has nerves of steel, somebody who would rather shut down his business than compromise the constitutional rights of his customers. And it's with great pleasure that I now get to introduce you to Ladar Levison.
Whatever you do, don't call me a freedom fighter, because that seems to be synonymous with terrorists these days. I am a strict constitutionalist. For those of you who don't know, my name is Ladar Levison. I was the founder and owner and operator of Lavabit. And quite simply, I'm also the guy who gave Obama the finger. For those of you who don't know about my story, I'll tell a quick little narrative, include a few things that I can talk about. Effectively, I was approached by a large federal agency that was requesting access to the secure communications of my customers. And in order to do that, they needed my cooperation, both in terms of physical access, but also in terms of information so that they could understand the data that was crossing the wire. And I didn't want to give it to them. So I did what any good American would do. I tried to fight it out in court. Guess what? I lost. So, because I didn't want to go to jail, and because I wanted to hold on to the little bit of money I had left, I decided that I'd give them the information that they requested. And while they were figuring out how to take that information and apply it, I walked off over to the side, and I pushed a big red button that was labeled "Shut Down." They don't like me too much for that. Well, I should qualify that. The FBI agents who came over to accept the information from me, they were actually quite happy. They thought I was going to shoot them. All I did was shut down. Win for them, right? Welcome to Texas. I should probably give a disclaimer. That story I just told may or may not be fiction, may or may not be based on a true story. I don't want to get in too much trouble. I figure with my narrative out of the way, I'd talk a little bit more about the bigger issue, the one that's affecting every company, every American technology company, and not just mine. And that's the issue of trust. Can we trust US-based service providers? Can we trust US-based hardware manufacturers? Software companies? The answer is no. The simple fact is, we don't know which of them have been approached, which of them have been forced to introduce vulnerabilities into their products or provide a method for our government to conduct surveillance. And because they can't even tell us what they've done in the past, we don't know who's compromised. So if we're at all paranoid, if you're in a business like the one I was in, where protecting the security of your environment and your systems and the privacy of your data is paramount, you have to be a little bit paranoid, and that quickly means distrusting everyone, or at least everyone that's based here in the US. Now, why should you guys care? If you're not in the technology business, you're thinking it probably doesn't affect you. Well, you're probably wrong there too. Forrester Research recently came out and said that they're estimating that cloud service providers here in the US are going to lose as much as 25% of their business over the next 3 years because of all of the surveillance that our government is doing here in the US. That's $180 billion right there. We're talking about companies like Google, Apple, Microsoft, Yahoo, even Amazon Cloud Services. But it doesn't stop there. What about US-based hardware manufacturers? Can we really trust the AES, the encryption extensions in our Intel chips? What about Dell, HP, AMD? You know, we've already heard reports of situations where those companies have been approached and been required to place interesting devices into machines that were being shipped to potential targets. There's a rumor going around that when Snowden arrived in Russia, the KGB got so worried they tossed out all their computers and switched back to using typewriters. They just couldn't trust their American-made computers anymore. It goes on. What about our software companies? How many of you trust Microsoft? Yeah, you're in the same boat as me. But what about other companies, like Symantec, a company that specializes in security? How do we know their antivirus product hasn't been altered to ignore federal spyware? Or VMware? Or any of the other large American software companies? Secrecy, in this case, is killing us. Smartphones, too. Let's talk about those. The US has some of the biggest chip manufacturers when it comes to smartphones. Qualcomm, TI, Broadcom. How do we know that the encryption being done on these chips in our smartphones hasn't been compromised? How do we know it's not just a modern version of a Clipper chip? I was recently talking to one startup that's working on a secure phone. And they were telling me that they basically now have to source all of the parts that are going to go into that phone from places other than the United States and China. Doesn't leave too many options. But fact is, you just can't trust people. You can't trust the companies that make the products that we use every day, the products that are responsible for securing our communications. Give you an interesting anecdote. Some of you remember when IBM sold off their PC computer division to Lenovo, and everyone was worried that this American manufacturer was going over to China, and with all the government contracts, we couldn't trust it anymore. Of course, if you were at all paranoid, like I was, or anyone else who was involved in information security, all of a sudden you stopped buying Lenovo products, aka ThinkPads, things like that. What's interesting is, given everything that's come out recently, we're starting to think Lenovo might actually be the better option, at least when we're comparing it to a US manufacturer, because we think China doesn't want to jeopardize their technology industry by introducing chips to spy on people. Full circle, right? The fact is, the systems we use every day are so complex that it's basically impractical to audit them for any kind of vulnerability. In fact, I could describe systems to you where it would actually be mathematically impossible to prove that they were compromised unless you knew the secret key needed to access that vulnerability. That's what we're facing today. The people who design these systems that introduce these vulnerabilities, they're pretty smart. They've had a lot of practice. They know how to cover their tracks. And using cryptography, they can make it, like I said, impossible to prove that they've done anything wrong. You couple that with the secrecy, and you start to see the problem that American technology companies face when it comes to trust. Let's talk about the law. I love talking about the law these days. I've learned a lot about it recently. If you talk to a lawyer, and I did earlier this week, a former Department of Justice lawyer who's argued before the FISA court, he gave me a list of arguments that you could use to stop these types of things from happening. Thought I'd repeat that list for you. He said you could make the argument that it provided for an undue burden to implement whatever the government wanted, that it was a violation of your business practices, that it violated contracts you may have in place, or even treaties, like the one the Department of Commerce negotiated with Europe, so that European companies could send private information to the US. For those of you who don't know, the EU basically has a provision in their law that says it's illegal to turn over private information to companies that are located in countries that do not have sufficient safeguards for privacy in their law. And apparently the US failed that test. But the Department of Commerce negotiated a little treaty that said, grant us basically an exception. And that was, under that exception, American companies were able to do business over in Europe. I think that exception's coming up for review. I don't think it's going to pass. Talk about one more thing. Thank you. Deceptive trade practices. Interesting little battle going on in the federal government right now between the FTC and the Department of Homeland Security. The FTC is charged with ensuring that companies don't participate in deceptive trade practices. Well, I'd say advertising a secure product that is really being used to conduct surveillance or allows the government to conduct surveillance would be a deceptive trade practice. So they don't like each other too much. But the bottom line is, if you're a small business owner like I was, it can be hard to make any of these arguments. How many people have budgeted for a $500 an hour lawyer to go defend what should already be guaranteed by our Constitution? I know I didn't. I told you I lost. Well, the fact is, even though you can make the arguments, the government gets to choose which court you make those arguments in. And they know which courts are going to be more favorable to their arguments and which ones aren't. And that's assuming they stick to a federal court. They can also choose to do some of these things through the FISA court, aka the kangaroo court. And then we really wouldn't hear about it, right? The simple fact is, it just depends on what judge you get. They get to decide, because there is no law preventing them from doing any of the things that have come out recently in terms of breaching the public trust, introducing vulnerabilities into our products. Nothing to prevent them from doing that. In fact, if anything, it's quite the opposite. When these battles first started, companies complained that if they adhered to the requirements of a court order, they could be brought up on civil or even criminal charges, because what they were being asked to do was effectively illegal. So what did Congress do? Gave them immunity. took away that argument. Think about that. Our government is asking us to break the law and then saying it's okay because they're asking. Double standard. I am going to try and take questions at the end, so if you have any. Let's talk about Congress a little bit more. They didn't just pass laws to provide immunity for these companies. They've also passed laws that make it a crime to talk about these crimes. Think about that. Our government's gotten smart in the last 230 or so years. They realized if you're going to violate the Constitution and you don't want to get in trouble for it, just make it illegal for anybody that knows about these violations to talk about it. I'd say that makes it a little bit hard to have an open and free society, an open and free discussion about right and wrong. Because isn't the law supposed to represent right and wrong? I know that's a little naive, but that's what I like to believe. Give you some of the arguments I've heard. Recently from federal agents. They like to say that this whole argument about how it's going to hurt your business if people find out, well, they'll just tell you, we'll keep it a secret. Nobody will ever find out. I love that one, especially in light of the summer of Snowden. But what if they have to use the information they collect in a court of law? They're going to have to tell people how they got it. At least if we're talking about an order that was issued in a criminal complaint. If it was a FISA complaint, they can just keep that to themselves, right? I've talked to a lot of people under the age of 30 recently, and it's interesting to see how their political beliefs have changed in recent months. I don't know how many people have told me, I never would have voted for Obama in the last election if I knew what he was doing during his first term. Think about that. He's avoiding the political cost of his actions by keeping them secret. He'll claim it's for national security or because he doesn't want to jeopardize an investigation. But the simple fact is, most Americans wouldn't stand for this kind of action. And we would express that distaste at the ballot box, if we knew. I think I've made a pretty strong case for the problem. This is where I get to try and put my lawyer hat on. I'm not a very good lawyer. Try and come up with solutions. I'm an American. I want to see American tech companies succeed. We need to restore that trust that was built up in that sector over the years. It's going to be hard. It's not going to be overnight. And it shouldn't be. But there are things that we can do beyond simply what I'm trying to do now in the court system. Because that only addresses a very narrow issue. The bigger issue needs to be addressed by Congress. And it starts by putting limits on what the federal government can do when it comes to conducting surveillance. How far can they go? Can they put spyware on our computers? Can they force companies to introduce vulnerabilities? How about in situations like mine, a service provider, a third party? Do we have any rights? What about our intellectual property, our source code, our encryption keys, our passwords, access to our network? What do we have to provide to federal investigators? Certainly things we wouldn't provide to anybody else. Not if we wanted to keep our network secure. What about if we do cooperate with an investigation? How do we know that these devices that have been placed on our network are only collecting the information that they're legally authorized to do? We can't audit them. They won't even tell us who makes them. If you're going to take the private information of a service provider, don't they have some right to ensure that it's only used for what it's supposed to be used for? Shouldn't we be able to audit? That's setting aside the issue of civilian oversight of the larger programs. The fact is, if the FISA court issues a warrant to collect additional information, the government doesn't need to tell us they've modified the parameters on that device to start collecting more than it was originally intended to. They can just log in remotely and change the parameters. Service provider didn't need to know, so we didn't tell them. Don't you love the rules regarding classified information? There's also the issue of secrecy. I don't know. My take on it is there shouldn't be such a thing as a secret court order. That's effective. Thank you. It seems like common sense, but to have a court effectively creating law that is binding to American citizens and American companies, and then to keep that secret, that goes against everything that our country was, that we fought for when this country was created. How can you fight against something? I mean, we're all here at a political action conference trying to influence leaders to make better laws for tomorrow. How do we do that if we don't know what laws are already out there? My solution is, when you get one of these secret court orders, and it's doing something that you think is new, give us the option to go public with everything except the target of the investigation. Let us make that request, give the government a fair amount of time, and then let them choose to either grant the request to make things public or withdraw it. I think it's fair. I don't think the Department of Justice, the FBI, or the National Security Agency will like my idea. But to me, that's the only way you can ensure the type of transparency we need to know that we're still living in a free country. I think we also need to define the thresholds that need to be met before some of these things can take place. Our government is going to pretty extreme lengths to conduct surveillance on pretty small cases and to collect very small amounts of intelligence information. Can't really get into details, unfortunately, but it's pretty crazy. What they're willing to sacrifice. I mean, think about that. We spend, what, about $25 billion a year on some of these surveillance programs and the infrastructure to support it. We're talking about how many hundreds of billions of dollars that are going to be lost now that people are learning about it. We're willing to pay that price just to collect, what? To know when somebody logs in? Pretty crazy. As far as I'm concerned, cut the budget, give me a tax cut. I just don't like the idea of my own tax dollars being used to collect my own personal information and then use it against me. Talk about the problem of education in this country. What about turning all of those analysts that are listening to our phone calls and reading our emails into school teachers? I mean, the simple fact is that if we don't change the way this works, it's going to have a profound effect, not only on our economy, but on our culture. The government, our government, needs an enemy in order to get away with some of these programs. First it was the communists, now it's the terrorists. Tomorrow it'll be, I don't know, us? I think it's time for an end to the imperial presidency. Well, I've run out of notes, so any questions? I could be literally locked away, and this was the dilemma I faced before I shut down my service. I could be locked away in jail and still not have the ability to tell you why I was in jail. Think about that. How do you raise money for your own defense? How do you tell Congress that the laws they passed are flawed if you can't talk about them?
Who's paying for your defense?
Well, it bankrupted me long before I shut down, or put me pretty close to the edge. But I was pretty fortunate. When I shut down, I put a link on Lavabit.com that's still there, and I was able to set up a legal defense fund. And I literally had tens of thousands of people donate $5 to $10. And we managed to raise about $150,000 for this fight.
And how do I find that out so I can contribute?
Yeah, like I said, the link is still up at lavabit.com. Down at the bottom, it says defending the Constitution is expensive. My lawyers tell me $150,000 will get me about halfway to the Supreme Court. They also tell me it'll take about 2 years. Think about what that does to my business and why I had to shut down. I mean, there was no way I could have fought this in secret. I wouldn't have been able to afford the necessary counsel.
How do you sleep at night?
I sleep a lot better now that it's shut down. Certainly had trouble sleeping leading up to that decision. I mean, I was facing an impossible choice. Go to jail or become a federal listening post and know that all of the things I was advertising on my website were no longer true. I was no longer providing a secure and private service. In fact, if anything, I would have lost control over the security of my network. And as a network admin that takes security pretty seriously, that was pretty troubling. Although it only seemed to bother me, not the people I was talking to.
God bless you for making the correct decision.
Thank you.
We all appreciate it.